night Seren Vale nearly died in the Ashwood Forest was the same night the world she thought she understood collapsed entirely. Not with violence, not with screaming, but with the sound of something enormous moving through the dark between the trees. Something that breathed like thunder and walked like a landslide. Something that placed itself between her body and the arrows, meant to end her life with a deliberateness that could not be mistaken for accident. She had been told, as all members of the Vorn pack were told from childhood, that bears were chaos, that they were solitary, unpredictable, and dangerous, that the old alliance between the shifting bears of the northern mountains and the wolf packs of the lowland territories had dissolved centuries ago, before anyone living could remember it, and that what remained of the bear shifters was nothing more than legend and cautionary tale. She had believed this because she had been given no reason not to. She was a healer, not a historian. She stitched wounds and brewed tonics, and set broken bones and asked no questions about things that did not bleed. And yet, in the cold breath of that autumn night, with 3 crossbow bolts embedded in a silver-furred flank that was wider than her entire body, she looked into the amber eyes of the largest living creature she had ever seen, and understood with absolute certainty that everything she had been told was incomplete. The Vorn pack territory stretched across 400 miles of lowland forest, river valley, and mountain approach, and at its center sat the stone citadel of Kale's Ridge, which was less a fortress than a small city built into the bones of a mountain, layered with centuries of expansion, renovation, and the particular architectural stubbornness of a lineage that had held this territory without interruption for 11 generations. Alpha King Caspian Vorn was the 11th of that lineage, and he ruled the way his father had ruled, and his father, before him, which was to say with complete authority over every strategic decision and a systematic inattention to everything that did not directly threaten his borders or his pack's military capacity. He was not a cruel man. Everyone who served under him would have said this quickly and without hesitation. He was not cruel. He was simply focused in a way that left very little room for anything outside that focus. And what fell outside it tended to fall very far indeed. Seren had been falling, outside Caspian Vorn's notice for 6 years. She had come to Kale's Ridge at 19, brought from the smaller satellite pack of Thornfield by an elder healer named Marin, who had recognized in her an unusual aptitude for medicinal craft. Marin had died 2 years later, and Seren had inherited her workspace, her supply stores, and her position, which was technically listed in the Citadel's administrative records as senior healer, 3rd rank, a title that sounded more significant than it was. In practice, it meant she occupied a set of rooms in the lower east wing, had access to the Citadel's herb stores and drying chambers, treated everyone from kitchen workers to off-duty soldiers, and was occasionally permitted into the upper medical ward when a warrior of sufficient rank was injured seriously enough to require her specific expertise. She had met Caspian Vorn exactly 4 times in 6 years. Once in a corridor, when she had pressed herself against the wall to let his guard retinue pass, and he had not looked at her. Once in the medical ward, when she had been called to consult on a fever that the senior medical staff were struggling to break, and he had looked at her only long enough to ask if she was confident in her diagnosis, and then returned his gaze to his injured Beta when she said yes. Once at the pack's winter assembly, when all residents of Kale's Ridge gathered in the Great Hall, and she had stood near the back and watched him speak about border security for 40 minutes. And once, 6 months ago, in the outer courtyard, when she had been crossing to the supply building and he had been returning from a morning run, still half-shifted, his wolf's silver trailing from his shoulders like shed light, and he had stopped for a moment, just for a single breath, and looked at her with an expression she could not name before one of his captains called his attention, and he turned away. She had thought about that moment more often than she would ever admit to. Anyone. If you have ever felt like a person who exists slightly to the left of where the important things happen, then you understand Seren Vale's particular relationship with her own life at this point in it. She was not unhappy exactly. She found deep satisfaction in her work. She had 2 friends in the citadel, a young soldier named Petra, who had come to her with a badly healed wrist fracture and stayed for the conversation, and an old records keeper named Dort, who let her use the archive, library on quiet evenings, and never asked why she needed to read. She had built something real and functional from the materials available to her, and she tried most days to find that sufficient. But there was a quality to her life at Kale's Ridge that she could never quite shake, a sense of being adjacent to something rather than part of it, of being useful without being known, of mattering in the way that a well-made tool matters, but not in the way that a person matters. She did not know why. This feeling persisted. She had no evidence that she deserved more than what she had. She simply could not stop the low, persistent hum of knowing that something was missing, though she could not have told you what shape the missing thing was. She would learn its shape in the Ashwood forest, 3 arrows' breadth from death, with a bear's warm blood on her hands. If you are new to this channel, welcome. We tell stories here that stay with you. Make yourself comfortable, because this one is going to take a while, and it is worth every minute. If you have been here before, you already know what to do. Settle in, and let's begin properly. The assignment that took Serene into the Ashwood forest that evening was not unusual in itself. A message had arrived in the late afternoon from a shepherd's family whose holding sat at the forest's edge, describing a child with a deep leg wound from a farming tool that had become infected faster than expected. It was the kind of call she received. Regularly, families at the pack's territorial margins, who could not easily reach the Citadel's medical facilities and relied on healers willing to make the journey to them. She had her route. She had her bag. She had made this kind of trip dozens of times before, and she saw no particular reason to inform anyone of her destination before she left, because she never had before, and no one had ever asked her to. This small, ordinary failure of communication would later strike Caspian Vorn as one of the most painful details of the entire event, not because it was negligent, but because it illustrated, with the clarity of a blade, exactly how thoroughly she had learned to exist in his pack without assuming that anyone would want to know where she was. The forest path was well worn for the first 2 miles, and Serene walked it easily in the fading light, with the sure-footedness of someone who had made this trip in worse conditions. The 3rd mile was where the path narrowed and bent, northeast toward the shepherd's holding, and it was there, at a point where the trees grew close enough to touch overhead, that she became aware of movement on both sides of her that was not the normal movement of the Ashwood at dusk. She had grown up at the edge of pack territory. She knew the difference between wind in underbrush and bodies in underbrush. She slowed her pace. She did not run, because she had also learned that running was usually the wrong decision, and because her healer's mind was already cataloging what she had in her bag that might be useful if this became what she thought it might become. There was very little in a healer's bag that was useful against people who wanted you dead. She was still performing this unhelpful inventory when the first figure stepped onto the path ahead of her. There were 5 of them. She would learn this later. In the moment, she was only aware of the one in front of her, and the sounds of the others positioning in the trees to her sides, and the specific quality of their stillness, which was the stillness of people who had done this before and were not uncertain about how it would end. They wore no pack insignia. Their faces were covered, but their scent was wolf, unmistakably, which meant this was not a bandit situation, but something internal to the pack's politics, which was somehow worse, because it meant someone had decided she mattered enough to be a target, and she had spent 6 years believing the opposite. Serene. Vale, said the one on the path, which confirmed that this was deliberate and specific, and not a case of wrong place, wrong time. You're not going to the Merrick holding. She said nothing. Her healer's training told her to keep her breathing even, which she did, at the cost of considerable effort. There's a message for the Alpha King, the figure continued. You're the message. She had one moment, a single clear and surprisingly calm moment, to think that she wished she had told someone where she was going, not because it would have saved her, but because it would have meant that at least one person in Kale's Ridge would notice she was missing before morning. Then the crossbow bolt punched through the air where her head had been, because she had moved, instinctively. throwing herself sideways into the undergrowth, and the chaos began. She ran. There was no strategy in it. She ran between trees with branches tearing at her face and bag swinging against her hip, and the sound of pursuit absolutely present behind her, and she was fast, faster than people expected a healer to be. But she was not faster than trained soldiers in their own territory in the dark, and she knew it, and she ran anyway because what else do you do? And the second bolt clipped her left shoulder and spun her partially around, and she caught herself against a tree and kept moving, bleeding now, the hot, wet drag of it down her arm. And the third bolt hit the tree 2 inches from her face and lodged in the bark so close she felt the vibration of it in her cheek. She was out of running options. She could hear them on 3 sides. There was nowhere left that was not toward them. She put her back against the tree with the bolt in it, because at least it was solid, and she faced what was coming. And she thought, with the specific and almost peaceful clarity that sometimes arrives at the end of fear, that she hoped the child at the Merrick holding was seen to by someone else, that she hoped Petra and Dort were having a good evening, that she wished she had asked 6 years ago why Caspian Vorn had looked at her like that in the courtyard, just once, just to know. The sound that came from the dark ahead of her was not a wolf sound. It was not any sound she had a category for. It was below sound in some frequencies, a vibration more than a noise, and it moved through the ground and the bark at her back and the fillings in her teeth before it registered as hearing, and then the trees between. Her and the nearest pursuing figure exploded outward, like they had been hit by a siege engine, and something silver and enormous was simply present where there had been darkness. And the screaming that followed was very brief. She did not move. She physically could not move. The thing, and it was enormous. It was the size of a draft horse, but denser, lower, all that mass distributed through shoulders and haunches that looked like architecture, stopped between her and the remaining figures, and it turned its head, and she looked into amber eyes the size of her fist, and for reasons she would never be able to fully articulate, she was not afraid. She was a great many other things, suspended in breathless suspension, deeply aware of her bleeding shoulder, acutely conscious of the 3 crossbow bolts now embedded in the silver flank facing away from her. But she was not afraid of the bear. The remaining figures ran. She did not blame them. The bear stood in the space between her and the boy, direction of the running for a long moment, and she watched it breathe, watched the great ribcage expand and contract, watched the 3 bolts shift with each breath, and then, slowly, as though it had made a decision, it turned to face her completely, and sat. It simply sat, enormous and bleeding and somehow entirely unthreatening in its posture, and looked at her with those amber eyes, and she stared back, and the forest was very quiet around them. "You're hurt," she said, because she was a healer. And this was apparently the kind of person she was. The bear blinked. "I'm going to help you," she said, already reaching for her bag. "If you'll let me. You can say no. I mean, obviously you can say no. I'm not going to argue with something your size about medical consent, but I'd like to try." The bear did not move as she approached. It did not move as she worked by touch, and the thin light filtering through the canopy, fingers finding the bolts with the same clinical certainty they always found what needed finding, working the first one free with the patience she used on any difficult wound, talking quietly the whole time, not to calm it, she would realize later, but because she was the kind of person who talked when she was concentrating and she had stopped bothering to be embarrassed about it years ago. The bear made a sound, low and resonant, when she extracted the second bolt. Not pain, exactly. Something more like acknowledgement. She had just finished wrapping the third wound with strips torn from the spare linen in her bag when the bear shuddered in a way that was not an animal shudder, and what sat before her, wrapped in her linen strips, was a man. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought the bear was. I want to see your predictions before we go any further, because this story is going to get so much more complicated from here. He was large even in human form, which should not have surprised her, and did anyway. He had the build of someone who had never in his life been cold, broad through everything, with a jaw that looked structural and silver-streaked dark hair that sat in disarray around a face that was weathered and angular, and at this moment, set in an expression of considerable pain that he was visibly refusing to fully show. He was perhaps 40, perhaps older. It was difficult to tell with shifters whose lineages ran deep. His eyes, still amber, looked at her with an attention that was different from the bear's attention, but contained the same quality she could not name, which was the quality of seeing her specifically rather than seeing a person-shaped thing in a space. "You talk a great deal when you're working," he said. His voice was deep, with a roughness to it that had nothing to do with the wounds and everything to do with how it was made. "I've been told," she said. "You should have warned me you were a shifter. I would have used the deeper stitching thread." Something moved in his face that might have been the beginning of a smile, if it had not had so far to travel. "I thought the fur was a sufficient indication. Bears are extinct in this territory. I was operating on the assumption of wildlife." She was already reassessing her work on the wounds, determining whether the shift had complicated anything, and her hands were steady, which she was separately and quietly proud of. "What's your name?" "Aldrich." She filed this away. "Aldrich. Can you walk?" "Yes." "Can you walk to the Merrick Holding? It's 1/2 mile northeast. There's a child there who needs attention, and I need light and a clean surface to properly close what I've started." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You were nearly killed 20 minutes ago." "I'm aware. The child didn't do that." She stood, shouldered her bag, and offered him a hand that he did not need but accepted anyway. And they walked through the ashwood in the dark, and she asked him nothing about who he was or where he had come from, or how he had known to be there, because her training had taught her that people revealed what they needed to reveal when they were ready, and that pressure rarely improved the quality of information. He helped her with the child at the Merrick Holding, which she had not expected, and which revealed, in the pragmatic efficiency of his assistance, that he had some medical knowledge of his own, not a healer's training, but something older, field-learned. The child's mother offered them food and a place to sleep, and Seren accepted the food and declined the sleep, because she needed to get back to Kale's Ridge, and she needed to tell someone what had happened in the forest. He walked with her back down the forest path, and did not say, when they reached the point where the trees had been destroyed, that this was where things had happened. They both simply walked past it. At the edge of the ashwood, where the tree line broke and the lights of Kale's Ridge were visible on the ridge above them, she stopped and turned to face him. "You're going to need to come with me," she said. "Not because you're required to, but because whoever sent those people is going to send more when they find out it didn't work. And whatever you are and whatever you're doing here, you're safer inside those walls than outside them." He studied her for a long moment. "You're inviting me into an Alpha King stronghold. I'm inviting you into a medical facility where someone with arrows recently extracted from them should sleep with proper supervision." She met his gaze. "I'll deal with the political complications." He came with her. She would think about this later. The fact that he came, that he had been ready to refuse everything and had agreed to this, and she would wonder what it meant. And she would not yet have the context to understand it. But she would remember the look on his face as she turned toward the ridge, which was not the look of a man who had been persuaded. It was the look of a man who had been waiting a very long time for someone to say exactly that. Caspian Vorn was not asleep when the report reached him, because he had not been sleeping well for reasons he had declined to examine. He was in his study with the Border Patrol reports that never stopped arriving, and the political correspondence that never stopped requiring answers, and he was performing the function of ruling with the discipline and thoroughness that had characterized everything he had done since he was old enough to understand what he was, which was the Alpha King's heir, and then the Alpha King himself, with very little space between those two things for anything else to develop. He had been 17 when his father died, 11 generations of Vorn kings, and every one of them had died before their sons were ready. He had decided, somewhere in the exhausted grief of that year, that readiness was a thing you forced into existence rather than waited for, and he had been forcing it ever since. Captain. Rena arrived at his study door at the 2nd hour past midnight, which was late enough that her knock carried urgency in its pattern, and he said come before the second knock was finished. She entered with the controlled expression of someone who had seen unexpected things and was managing the experience of them professionally. Alpha King, she said. The South Gate Watch reports that Healer Vale has returned from the Ashwood Road with a wound to her left shoulder and a male companion carrying injuries consistent with multiple crossbow bolts. He presents as a large shifter, bear phenotype, which the watch initially could not confirm as possible given that there have been no bears in this territory since the Aldrich Compact dissolved, Caspian said. And he was standing before he finished the sentence, in the way he stood when something reached him that required his full attention rather than his administrative functions. The Aldrich Compact. He had read about it in historical texts. Every alpha heir of the Vorn line was made to read the historical archives of their lineage as part of their preparation for rule, and the Aldrich Compact was a chapter that most of his tutors had described as a historical curiosity rather than a living document. An alliance between the Vorn pack and the mountain bear shifters, sealed in blood, promising protection for the alpha's fated mate until the bond was claimed. Dissolved, it was generally agreed, when the bear lineage died out in this territory. Where is she now? Her medical room's Alpha King. She went there directly. And the bear? Rena's expression did this particular thing it did when she was delivering information that she personally found surprising. She brought him with her. He is currently also in her medical rooms. He was already moving. He did not ask himself why he was moving with this particular quality of urgency, the kind that bypassed analysis and arrived already in motion, because he had been not examining things about Seren Vale for some time, and this did not seem like the right moment to start examining them. He had been not examining the way he always knew, with a precision that had nothing to do with sight. When she was in a room he was also in. He had been not examining the way that single moment in the courtyard 6 months ago had lodged in him, with the permanence of something structural rather than incidental. He had been not examining the fact that he had pulled her file from the administrative records 3 weeks ago on the pretext of reviewing all mid-level staff, and had spent an embarrassing amount of time reading the documentation of 6 years of work that had been quietly exceptional by any measure, and that the word adjacent to the one he found himself thinking while reading it was not impressed, but rather something closer to ashamed. The lower east wing was not a part of the citadel he frequented. The hallway that led to her rooms was narrow and plain, lit by wall-mounted lanterns that burned lower than the main corridors, and it smelled of dried herbs and something clean and medicinal that he would now always associate with this moment. He reached her door, which was open, and stood in the doorway. She was at her work table, her back to him, her injured left arm moving with only slight evidence of the wound as she organized what she had used, refilling, resetting, the automatic order of a person who cleaned their workspace as a form of decompression. On the narrow examining bed along the wall, bandaged at 3 points and awake, was the largest man Caspian had ever seen. The man's amber eyes moved to the doorway as Caspian arrived, and stayed there with an attention that was not challenge exactly, but was not submission either, the attention of something very old looking at something it had been expecting. Seren turned when she registered the quality of the silence. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and in that moment something happened that he would later describe to no one, because he had no language for it that did not sound either melodramatic or incomplete, which was that the thing he had been not examining for 6 months was suddenly and entirely visible to him in a way that made not examining it no longer possible. It was like a sound becoming audible after having been just below the threshold for a long time. His wolf knew, had known, had been trying to tell him in every way, available to it for months, and he had been overriding it with administrative priority and strategic focus, and the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided that ruling left no room for being surprised. His mate was standing in front of him with a bandaged shoulder, and her sleeves rolled up, and a look on her face that was managing several things at once, including tiredness, caution, and a composure that he recognized as the composure of someone who had learned not to assume they were wanted wherever they were. He had done that. That composure had been built, at least in part, by 6 years of being exactly as invisible to him as she had learned to expect. Do not go anywhere, because what happens next in this room is the beginning of the real story, and I promise you, it is not what either of them expects. Subscribe if you want to make sure you don't miss where this goes. You're wounded, he said, which was not the most intelligent thing available to him, but was what came out. Minor, she said. Shoulder. It's already closed. She paused. The Ashwood Road. I should have informed someone of my destination before I left. I understand if that's a protocol violation. That is not what I want to talk about right now, he said. All right. She waited. She was good at waiting. He had the sharp, unpleasant sense that she had become good at it specifically in relation to him, or to people like him. People whose attention she had learned not to hold her breath for. He came, fully into the room. He looked at the man on the examining bed, who had been watching this with the careful neutrality of someone with significant context, who had decided this was not his scene to direct. Aldrich, Caspian said. Alpha King, the man said, with a gravity that was neither formal nor casual, but was instead the tone of someone greeting something they had had a long time to think about. The compact, Caspian said. The compact, Aldrich confirmed. Seren looked between them. Would someone like to explain to me what the compact is, since it apparently involves me directly, and I have never heard of it? Caspian pulled the chair from her desk without asking if he could, set it facing her, and sat. She remained standing for a moment, then apparently decided that this was going to be a long conversation, and sat on the other end of her work table, which brought them close enough that he could see the fine details of the exhaustion on her face and the particular steadiness of her eyes that he had underestimated for 6 years and would not underestimate again. The Aldrich Compact, he said, is a blood oath made in the 5th generation of the Vorn line between my ancestor, Alpha King Dorian Vorn, and the first bear of the Mountain Shifters, whose name was also Aldrich, which is traditional in that lineage for each generation's head. He watched her process this. The oath committed the bear lineage to protect the Alpha King's fated mate during any period in which the bond was unrecognized, unsealed, or deliberately avoided. In exchange, the Vorn Pact guaranteed safe harbor and territorial rights to the bear lineage for as long as the compact held. Seren was quiet for a moment. You said unsealed or deliberately avoided. Yes. Which category applies here? He held her gaze. I think you know. She looked at him for a long time with an expression that he could not read, which was unusual for him. He was generally competent at reading people. Then she said, For 6 years. Yes. You knew. My wolf knew. I suppressed it. He said this without flinching, because she deserved the truth and he was done with convenient evasion. It didn't seem compatible with what I needed to be, with what this pack needed me to be. And what did this pack need you to be that required ignoring your mate for 6 years? Invulnerable, he said, and meant it, and heard, in the silence that followed, how thoroughly that answer failed to be an adequate reason, even though it was a true one. She looked at the work table. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at Aldrich, who had been sitting in the silence with the stillness of a mountain, and she said, How long have you been in this territory? 3 years, Aldrich said, in the Ashwood and the northern approach. Watching. 3 years. She absorbed this. Were you ever going to tell anyone? The compact specifies that the bearer does not reveal themselves unless the mate's life is directly threatened, Aldrich said. Tonight was the first direct threat. Who were they? She asked. This question was directed at Caspian. I don't know yet, he said. I will. The quality in his voice when he said this was not a reassurance. It was a statement of fact with a very short timeline implied. The message they gave me, she said slowly. There's a message for the Alpha King, and you're the message. Someone in your pack thinks that I matter enough to be used as a message. Before tonight, I would have told you that was inaccurate. It was never inaccurate, he said. It was hidden. Hidden by you. Hidden by me. He did not look away. Seren, I'm not going to ask you to accept anything tonight. I'm not going to ask you to accept anything at all until I've given you a reason to. What I'm asking right now is that you let me put guards on this wing, and that you stay within the Citadel until I know who gave that order. That's a security request, not a personal one. You can hate me for the rest of it and still allow me that." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I don't hate you. You have reason to. Having reason to do something and doing it are different things." She slid off the work table. "I'm going to sleep. Aldrich needs monitoring through the night for the wounds. And I'd prefer to do it myself." She paused. "You can tell whoever you send to guard this wing that they should not knock. I'll know they're there." He stood. He was at the door when she said his name, just his name, Caspian, without title. And he turned, and she was looking at him with that expression he could not read, and she said, "The courtyard. 6 months ago. Did you know then?" He said nothing for a moment. Then, "My wolf had been telling me for longer than that." She nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had suspected and had not let herself believe. "Good night, Caspian. Good night, Siren." He walked back through the lower east wing with the narrow lanterns and the smell of dried herbs, and the specific weight of a man who has been confronted with the full accounting of something he chose not to see, and the weight was not comfortable, and he did not try to make it comfortable, because he thought it was probably important to carry it correctly for a while. By morning, he had the names. 3 soldiers from the eastern garrison, paid by a source that took until midday to trace but ultimately led, with the inexorable logic of investigation, to the office of Councillor Bryn, who was the 3rd highest-ranking member of his administrative council, and who had been opposed to every progressive policy Caspian had attempted to pass in the last 2 years, and who had apparently decided that the solution to the Alpha King's reformist tendencies was to destabilize him personally through the threat of harm to the person he most needed to protect. This was both more sophisticated and more stupid than most assassination plots, Caspian thought, in that it demonstrated genuine intelligence about his vulnerabilities and a profound miscalculation about how he would respond to having them activated. He called the council to assembly that morning. He had not slept. It did not show in any way that mattered. Councillor Bryn was a man in his 60s who had served on the Vorn Council since Caspian's father's time, which gave him a quality of institutional permanence that he had long mistaken for institutional indispensability. He sat at the council table with the composure of a man who did not know yet that the shape of his morning was about to change. Caspian looked at him for a long moment before the session began, and thought about the child at the Merrick holding, who Siren had been going to help when Bryn's soldiers intercepted her, and about the 3 bolts that had gone into a bear because Bryn had decided that one healer in the lower east wing was a useful piece in a game he had been playing against his own alpha. And then he thought about 6 years of a woman learning to exist in the margins because something that should have been visible was hidden, and how that hiding had made her invisible in ways that had made Bryn think she was unprotected. He had made her vulnerable by failing to claim what was already true. He would not make that error again in any direction. The session lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, Bryn had been stripped of his council seat. His territorial holdings were under administrative review, and the 3 soldiers who had been in the Ashwood were in holding cells. Caspian presented the evidence without theater, and allowed the council to reach its conclusions with the minimum amount of narrative assistance required, which was his normal method, and which the council generally found more unnerving than anger. The other councillors, looking at the evidence, looking at their Alpha King's face, and performing the rapid internal calculation that self-preservation requires, reached the correct conclusions efficiently. After the session, Captain Renna found him in the corridor and said, with the careful tone of someone conveying information they had been asked to convey, "Healer Vale requests that you not feel obligated to come to the lower east wing on her account, and also that Aldrich be formally granted safe haven within the Citadel, and that this be documented in the administrative records." He looked at Renna for a moment. "The second request is reasonable. Tell her it's already done. And the first? Tell her I'll be there this evening, and that she can choose whether to be in or out." There was a pause. "She is Alpha King, quite possibly the most self-contained person in this Citadel." "I know," he said. "That's not an argument against going. In the lower east wing that evening, Seren was in. She was at her work table when he arrived, working on what appeared to be a new formulation for something in the smaller of her two preparation bowls. And she said, without looking up, "Aldrich told me what happened in the council session. You have a fast source of information. He's been in this territory for 3 years. He knows things." She finally looked up. She had rested. It showed, not in softness, but in a quality of steadiness that had more ground under it than the previous night's exhausted composure. "Thank you. For Bryn. And for the documentation for Aldrich. Those were necessary actions. Necessary actions still require someone to take them." She set down what she was working on. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "What do you actually want? Not what the compact requires, not what the mate bond makes biologically uncomfortable to ignore. What you, Caspian Vorn, actually want, if you had to say it plainly." He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then he said, "I want to know you. I want to spend enough time in your company that the 6 years I spent being an idiot are outweighed by actual knowledge of who you are. I want to be the kind of alpha who knows where his healer is going when she leaves the Citadel on a night call, not because of surveillance, but because she trusts me enough to tell me." He paused. "I am aware that wanting things does not entitle me to them." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I'm having dinner with Petra and Dort tomorrow evening in the archive library. They are my people. If you want to know me, you start there. You come to the archive library and you eat with us and you do not make it strange." He felt something shift, not in his wolf, not in the instinct he had been managing for months, but in something closer to the surface, something almost like relief. "I will be there. Dort will talk about records for most of the meal. He is not impressed by rank." "Good," he said, and meant it. She picked up what she had been working on. "Aldrich is in the room at the end of the hall. He's been given temporary quarters, which he treats like a holding cell because he is not accustomed to walls. I told him to leave the window open and he looked at me like I'd said something revolutionary. He's been in the Ashwood for 3 years, Caspian said. 3 years watching me specifically, apparently, which I have complicated feelings about that I haven't finished sorting." She did not say this with accusation. She said it in the tone of someone who was conducting an honest inventory of their own responses. "I'll let you know when I've sorted them. That seems reasonable. Good night, Caspian." "Good night, Seren." He walked back through the corridor and thought that dinner in an archive library with a records keeper who was not impressed by rank was the most appealing thing on his schedule in years. The weeks that followed were a study in two people learning each other carefully, which is a different thing from falling into each other quickly, and which requires both people to be willing to be actually seen rather than performed. 4, which is considerably more demanding. Caspian came to the archive library for that first dinner and ate bread and hard cheese and dried fruit with Petra and Dort, and said almost nothing for the first hour, because Dort was indeed in the middle of a very detailed explanation of how the Vorn Pack's administrative record-keeping system had degraded in coherence after the 5th generation and had never been properly restored, and Caspian was genuinely interested, which surprised Dort enough, that he spent the second hour asking questions instead of talking, and this was, Seren would tell Aldrich later, the first moment she thought things might actually work. Petra, who had been Seren's friend for 3 years, and who was not a person who wasted time on social caution when she had a direct question available, looked at Caspian across the table at one point and said, "Did you know about the compact the whole time? Before this week, I mean?" "I knew about the compact as a historical document," he said. "I didn't know it was active. Did you know about Seren? As your mate?" "Petra," Seren said. "Seren," Petra said back, in the tone of a person who had been the repository of 6 years of a friend's quiet, unclaimed longing, and felt strongly that the person responsible for it should be asked direct questions. He can answer or not. Caspian looked at Petra with an expression that she would later describe as the look of a man who was getting exactly what he deserved, and knew it. "Yes," he said. "I knew. Not immediately, but for the last several months. I suppressed it because I thought it would interfere with what I needed to be. Did it occur to you?" Petra said. That what you needed to be might include the kind of person who doesn't make his mate feel invisible for 6 years? It occurs to me now, he said. Frequently. Petra considered him for a moment, then apparently decided this was an acceptable answer and went back to her cheese. Seren, who had been watching this exchange with her healer's composure firmly in place, looked at her hands and thought about the fact that she had a friend who would say that to an alpha king across a dinner table, and felt something in her chest that was not quite the claimed warmth of a sealed mate bond, but was its own kind of heat. Aldrich settled into the citadel with the particular adjustment of someone who had been alone for a very long time and was not entirely sure what to do with proximity. He left the window open. He went to the Ashwood most mornings and came back by midday, and no one in the citadel knew quite what to do with a bear shifter in their midst, but he was large enough and quiet enough, and the Alpha King's clear acknowledgement of him was unambiguous enough that the uncertainty settled into cautious acceptance relatively quickly. He helped Seren in the medical room sometimes, with the same quiet efficiency she had first observed at the Marek holding. And he talked, when he talked, in the straightforward way of someone who had never learned to soften things with social management. She came to trust this about him. She came to trust him, which was a different thing from gratitude, and took longer to arrive. She asked him, one afternoon, what his human name meant. He said it was the name of the first bear, the one who made the compact, and that it was given to each generation's head as a continuity marker. She asked him if that felt like a burden or an honor. He thought about it for a long time and said, both, mostly both. She asked him if he had wanted to break cover in the 3 years before the Ashwood. He said there had been moments when it was difficult not to. She asked what kind of moments, and he was quiet for a while and then said, when you walked alone at night, when I could see you were tired in the way that doesn't come from work. She thought about this. She said, the compact says you were protecting me. The compact says I was required to protect your life. He said, those are not always the same thing. She filed this distinction away. It joined a collection of things she was building slowly into an understanding of what the last 6 years had actually contained, which was different from what she had experienced them as, which required some significant internal rearranging. Caspian did not push. This was the thing that surprised her most, because she had expected the Alpha King, having identified and claimed what he wanted, to move toward it with the same decisive force he brought to everything else. Instead, he came to the archive library. He came to the medical rooms when he had injuries that did not require the upper ward, which she gradually realized was not coincidence but choice. And he sat on her work table while she worked. And he talked to her about the things he was managing, not asking her advice on them specifically, but including her in his thinking, which was something she had not experienced from anyone in a position of authority in 6 years, and which she found, to her own surprise, deeply comforting. He asked her things, what she was working on, what she had noticed in the pack's health patterns that the administrative records probably weren't capturing, whether the lower East Wing's lanterns were adequately maintained, because he had walked through it and noticed they burned lower than the main corridors, and he wanted to know if that had always been the case. She told him it had always been the case. He had the lanterns upgraded by the following day. This was not a grand gesture. It was the opposite of a grand gesture. It was the kind of attention that does not announce itself, that simply makes the world slightly more functional in the specific direction of one person's daily existence. And it was exactly, she would realize, the kind of attention she had needed, not the sweeping acknowledgement of someone suddenly discovering her significance, but the steady accumulation of someone choosing to notice. They were in her medical rooms one evening 3 weeks after the Ashwood, and she was telling him about a pattern she had identified in the healing times of soldiers from the Northern rotation, who were consistently recovering more slowly from the same injuries than soldiers from other rotations, which suggested either a nutritional deficiency specific to the Northern posting's food supply or a training protocol that was chronically overextending them. He was listening with his full attention, which was a particular quality of attention she had learned to recognize, the kind that meant he was not waiting for her to finish so he could respond, but was actually tracking and integrating what she was saying. He asked 3 questions. The third one was the right question. the one that clarified the most likely cause, and she answered it, and then looked at him and said, "You're going to fix it, aren't you?" "I'm going to look at the Northern Rotation's supply requisitions and training logs in the morning," he said. "You don't have to. It's a healer's observation, not an administrative report." "Seren," he looked at her, "you've been making these observations for 6 years. Where did they go?" She paused. "My records mostly. I file reports to the upper medical ward when I think they're significant enough. I don't always think they're significant enough. Starting next week," he said. "They come to me directly, not through 3 layers of administrative hierarchy. To me." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "All right." This was, Caspian thought, the first thing she had agreed to that felt like a step toward rather than an accommodation of. He recognized the difference and was careful with it. "Pause here and tell me, what do you think has to happen before she fully trusts him? I read every comment, and I want to know what you think the barrier is, because we are reaching the moment where everything either moves forward or falls apart. And I want to know if you see it coming." The barrier arrived not from within, but from without, as these barriers often do, which is to say it arrived in the form of information rather than feeling, and it arrived through Dort. Dort was not a gossip. He was, however, a records keeper of exceptional thoroughness, and when something in the records was inconsistent, it bothered him in the particular way that an off note bothers a musician, persistently and below the level of conscious priority until it demanded attention. He had been bothered for some weeks by an inconsistency in the records of Seren's original transfer from the Thornfield Pack 6 years ago. The paperwork was complete and properly filed. That was not the inconsistency. The inconsistency was in what was not in the paperwork, which was any documentation of why the Thornfield Pack senior healer had identified specifically Seren, out of 3 apprentice healers of similar training, for transfer to Kale's Ridge. He found the answer in the older archives, in the correspondence files of the 3rd year of Caspian's reign, which predated Seren's arrival, in a letter from the Alpha of Thornfield to the Vorn Pack's then Administrative Council, noting that his pack's blood registry had identified a lineage marker in one of his apprentice healers, consistent with the Vorn Alpha bloodline's historical mate bond profile, and asking for instructions on how to proceed with appropriate discretion. The Council's response was not in the Thornfield files. It was in the Vorn files, in a section Dort had not yet reached, and when he found it, he sat for a long time looking at it before he went to Seren. She read the letter twice. Then she put it down on Dort's work table and sat very still for a moment. The council had known. Not Caspian's current council, but the council that had preceded it. The one that had included older members since rotated out or retired, and at least 2 who were still active. They had received the information about the bloodline marker, and they had responded not by informing the Alpha King, which was the appropriate and obvious course of action, but by quietly arranging the transfer, situating her in the lower east wing, in the minor healer's position that Marin had conveniently vacated, and waiting. For what, exactly, the letter did not specify, but the picture it assembled when combined with what she already knew was one of deliberate management. She had been placed here. She had been placed here knowing what she was, and the people who had placed her had spent 6 years ensuring that the placement remained exactly as it was, minor, peripheral, visible only in usefulness. She brought the letter to Caspian. She did not bring it with accusation, because she was, by this point, reasonably certain that he had not known, and her instinct about people was generally sound. She brought it with the flatness of someone delivering information that requires a response, and she watched his face as he read it, and what she saw on his face was not guilt, which would have been the wrong response, and would have told her something concerning about his character. It was fury. Specific, cold, directional fury. The kind that has an address and is already writing it down. He looked up at her. "You knew none of this. None of it. When you came here. When Marin recruited you. I was told she had identified my aptitude in a regional skills assessment, which was true, as far as it went, but it wasn't the reason." "No." She paused. It also may not have mattered. If I'd known what I was coming to, I don't think I'd have come. I was 19 and I didn't want to mate. I wanted to learn. The outcome might have been worse if it had been honest. He set the letter down. The outcome was not good, Seren. No, she agreed. But it could have been differently, not good. He named the council members who had been active at the time. 2 were still on the A council. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quietness of someone thinking about what to do, but the quietness of someone who has already decided and is giving the decision a moment to settle before acting on it. I would like to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer honestly. All right, does knowing this change what you're building with me? Not whether you're angry. You have every right to be angry. But does it change the direction? She thought about this. She thought about 6 years of margins, and the courtyard moment, and the archive library, and the lanterns, and the Northern Rotation's nutritional records, and the way he listened with all of him when he was listening. She thought about the fact that she was sitting in his study having this conversation rather than being informed of it, that he had asked her rather than told her, that the fury on his face when he read the letter had been directed outward rather than at the situation's inconvenience to him. She thought about Aldrich saying the compact required protecting her life, and then saying that protecting a life and protecting a person were not always the same thing, and the fact that for 3 years someone had been doing the second one without being required to. No, she said. It doesn't change the direction. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to dismantle every structure in this pack that made this possible. Not only the 2 counselors, the systemic conditions that let a person be placed and managed like an asset, rather than known like a person. That is not a promise I'm making to you specifically. It's something that needs to happen regardless, but I want you to know it's happening. I know, she said. How? Because you're already angry about the Northern Rotation's food supply. She met his eyes. You're the kind of man who gets angry about things that don't directly affect him when they're wrong. I noticed it before I was looking for it. He looked at her. For a long moment, with an expression that had stopped being readable to her in the usual way, which she was learning meant he was feeling something he hadn't yet organized into language. Then he said, I'd like to seal the bond, Seren. When you're ready. Not because the compact requires it or the biology makes it uncomfortable. Because I want to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ask me again in a month. All right. Not because I don't want to, but because I want to, with full information and enough time. She looked at her hands. I have been wanting things I didn't claim for a long time. I'd like to claim this one correctly. He said, A month. Aldrich, when she told him that evening, looked at the window for a long moment, and then said, The first Aldrich would have sealed the bond immediately and spent the rest of his life regretting not knowing her first. She looked at him. How do you know that? It's in the original compact documentation, he said. Most people only read the obligation section. She thought about this for a while. Then she said, What happens to the compact when the bond is sealed? It's fulfilled. The bearer is released from obligation. And then? He looked at her. And then I go back to the mountains, presumably. She was quiet. She thought about 3 years in the Ashwood. She thought about amber eyes looking at her in the dark, without any of the quality of a creature that might harm her. She thought about the child at the Marek holding and the field medicine efficiency of his hands, and the way he said mostly both about the weight of a name he had never chosen. Or, she said, the compact is fulfilled and you stay because you want to. He was quiet for a long time. That's not in the documentation. No, she said. It wouldn't be. It was written by an Aldrich who didn't know her first. She looked at him. You've known me for 3 years. I'm asking if you want to stay. He looked at the open window. He looked at her. He said, Yes. She nodded. Good. Then that's what happens. Let me know in the comments if you saw that one coming because I want to know. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, now is the time. Because this story has one more thing to tell you, and it is the part that matters most. The month passed in the way that important months do, which is quickly in retrospect and slowly while you are inside them. full of ordinary moments that are ordinary in the doing and significant in the accumulation. Seren came to know Caspian not as an alpha king or a distant figure or the source of 6 years of invisible longing, but as a specific person, which was both more and less than the other versions, and also more sustainable than any of them. She learned that he was genuinely interested in administrative history, and would happily talk to Dort about the record-keeping degradation, for as long as Dort wanted to talk about it. She learned that he ran every morning, and that this was not discipline, but necessity. That there was something about his wolf that required the physical space of open land at least once a day, and that on the mornings when council business prevented it, he was measurably more careful with his own reactions for the rest of the day, which she found, unexpectedly, humanizing. She learned that he had been 17 when his father died, and had never had a space in which to be uncertain about anything afterward, and that this explained certain things about him that she had originally read as coldness. He learned that she talked when she concentrated, and was not embarrassed about it, and would talk him through her entire diagnostic process when he was in the room, which he found he preferred to silence in ways he hadn't expected. He learned that she had been reading in Dort's archive on her evenings off for years, not to study but because she found libraries physically comfortable in a way she had never found most social spaces, and that she had quietly accumulated a historical education to rival any formally trained scholar through sheer accumulated reading. He learned that she had opinions, which she had been conservative about expressing, and that they were good opinions, the kind that had clearly been thought about rather than performed. And he began actively asking for them in contexts where he would previously have asked only his counsel. He dismantled the conditions. He spent time in every meeting that month doing it, restructuring the reporting system so that knowledge and expertise moved through fewer intermediary layers, explicitly opening his schedule to guild heads and service representatives who had previously required 3 levels of administrative approval to reach him, reviewing the files of every individual who had been brought to Kale's Ridge through council arrangement, rather than direct recruitment, and ensuring that each of them had a clear and accurate understanding of their own standing and the actual reasons for their presence. There were 47 such individuals. Several of them had been in similar positions to Seren's for longer than she had. He personally reviewed each file. It took 12 days. He did it anyway. He addressed the council with the 2 remaining members from the old arrangement present. He did not strip them of their seats in the assembly. He did something he thought was probably worse, which was to put everything he had found into the permanent record and let the PAC's legal process determine what accountability looked like, which meant that the information was public and persistent, rather than resolved quietly and forgotten. The 2 counselors resigned within the week. Seren watched all of this from a position that was increasingly not the margins, which took some getting used to. She was consulted directly on PAC health matters that would previously have traveled upward through several intermediaries before reaching anyone with decision-making authority. She was introduced at a PAC assembly, not as third-rank healer, but as senior healer Vale, without qualification, and the nature of the introduction made several things clear to everyone in the room. And she stood in the front section of the Great Hall rather than near the back, and she thought about the distance between those 2 positions and how long it had taken to travel it, and decided that this was not a thought that needed to be completed right now. The morning she went to Caspian's study was exactly 1 month after the conversation, where she had asked him to wait. She arrived before his morning schedule started, which meant she had to tell the guard on duty that she was there, which she did with the composure of someone who had decided that claiming things required moving through the discomfort of claiming them. The guard admitted her without hesitation, which told her something about how the last month had shifted her status in the Citadel's informal understanding. And she went in, and he was already at his desk. And he looked up, and the expression on his face was one she could read, which was relief, and something under it that was deeper than relief. "It's been a month," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm ready." He came around the desk. He stopped in front of her, close enough that the mate bond hummed between them with the low warmth of something that had been waiting very patiently, and he looked at her with all of the attention that she had, spent 6 years not receiving, and was still learning to accept as her actual due, and he asked, Are you sure? Not the bond. You. The bond and I are in agreement, she said. We've had a month to discuss it. He put his hands on her face, carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who was aware of the weight of a gesture and was not being careless with it. And she felt the bond seal between them not with a flash, but with a settling, like something that had been slightly misaligned for years, finally finding its correct position. And she thought, there you are. There it is. This. They stood like that for a long moment, and she was aware that she was being known, specifically and completely in the way the bond permitted, and that it did not feel like exposure, but like recognition, which was different, which was what she had been waiting for, without knowing it was what she was waiting for. For the record, he said quietly, I am going to spend a significant portion of the rest of my life making up for the first 6 years. I know, she said. I'm going to let you. 3 days later, Aldrich came to find her in the medical rooms. He stood in the doorway with the air of someone delivering news that is both expected and significant. The compact is fulfilled, he said. I know, she said. I thought you should hear it formally. And the rest of it? She asked. He looked at the window. He looked at her. I'm staying, he said. She nodded. Good. The pack is going to find it. Strange. A bear in the citadel. The pack, she said, is getting used to strange things this season. I think they can manage. He almost smiled. She was getting better at seeing it. This story has one more chapter, and it belongs to the years. 3 years after the sealing, the Vorn Pack's health documentation was the most comprehensive in the region, organized into a system that Seren had designed, and that Caspian had implemented with the same thoroughness he brought to everything once he had decided it was worth doing. The Northern Rotation's nutritional deficiency had been identified, corrected, and the recovery time differential had closed within 2 seasons. The 47 individuals who had been placed rather than known had each, in their own way and on their own timeline, been seen. Some had left, finding that what they were was not suited to this pack, and had been released with support and documentation. Most had stayed. The lower East Wing's lanterns burned at the same height as the main corridors. Dort had, after extensive investigation of the archive records, concluded that the 5th generation's administrative degradation had been caused by a specific interim record keeper who had implemented a filing system based on a personal organizational philosophy that made sense to him and no one else. And he had spent 6 months correcting it and was openly triumphant about the results. Petra had been promoted twice and had developed a habit, which Seren found completely characteristic, of saying exactly what she thought in exactly the situations where no one expected her to say it, which made her excellent at her job and extremely effective at pack assemblies where clarity was required. Aldrich had built, with his own hands and over the course of 2 years, a structure at the Ashwood's edge that was partly den and partly workshop, where he spent several days each week and the rest of the time in the citadel. He had, to the consistent surprise of people who thought a bear shifter from the mountains would have limited interest in human architecture, opinions about the lower East Wing structural expansion that Caspian had found valuable enough to implement. He was not exactly integrated into the pack in the way a pack member was integrated. He was something adjacent to it, the way the oldest alliance documents described the bear lineage, not of the pack, but with it, which suited his nature and required no translation. Seren and Caspian had a daughter. She was 3.5, and she had her father's silver in her hair, and her mother's particular quality of watching things before she decided what she thought of them. And she had decided, clearly and without ambiguity, that Aldrich was the most interesting entity in her personal world, which meant she spent a significant portion of her time in the workshop at the Ashwood's edge, and was learning, from a large man with amber eyes and a great deal of patience, the names of every tree in the forest. Seren watched, one evening from the door of the workshop, as her daughter pointed at a birch and said the name Aldrich had given her for it, and Aldrich said it back with the particular gravity he gave to all correct information, and her daughter looked satisfied in the way of a person who has learned something that belongs to her now. Caspian was behind Seren, his arms around her in the easy way of two people who have built something real and know it. And he was watching the same thing. "She's going to know every tree in 100 miles by the time she's 5, Seren said. "Good," Caspian said. "She should know the land she's going to protect." Seren looked back at him. "You sound confident about that. She has your stubbornness, and my strategic instinct and Aldrich's patience," he said. "She'll be terrifying." Serene laughed, which she did more freely than she used to, and leaned back into him, and thought about the ashwood in the dark 3 years ago, and the amber eyes that were not afraid, and neither was she, and the long walk back up to the citadel lights that she had assumed, incorrectly, was a walk toward her ordinary life continuing. She thought about what it meant that the ordinary life had been the extraordinary one all along, not despite its margins and its quiet rooms and its lower lanterns and its years of being usefully invisible, but through them, because it had been building something real in the only way real things are built, which is slowly, and without ceremony, and in the particular darkness before someone finally holds a light to what has always been there. "Hey," Caspian said, in the tone he used when he knew she was thinking something complete. "Hey," she said back. "Tell me." She looked at her daughter learning birch trees from a bear. She looked at the forest. She looked at the lights of Kale's Ridge high on the ridge above them, all of them burning equally now, from the great hall to the lower east wing, every one of them burning at the same height, and she thought about how long that had taken, and how quietly it had been done, and what it had cost, and what it had given. "I was just thinking," she said, "that this was always going to be where we ended up, even when we couldn't see it." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Especially then. Below them, in the last light of the day, a small girl said the word for oak, and a bear told her she had it exactly right. If this story stayed with you, please like this video and leave a comment telling me which moment hit hardest. Was it the ashwood? The archive library dinner? The month of waiting? The lanterns? I read every single one. If you are not subscribed yet, hit that button now, because there are more stories coming and you do not want to miss them. Thank you for being here. Until next time.